generally speaking, whiskey drinkers don't need me to convince them much. So I'm going to focus a lot of my energy towards making sure that you non-whiskey drinkers get to maybe find something in this that you appreciate and maybe opens your eyes to something that maybe you weren't familiar with whiskey, because we've come a long way from just shooting Jameson. So these are some very fine whiskeys we're going to try here. To start things off, what I'd like you to do is pour a nice little dose, or a dram as they would call it, of your Balvenie 14 year. I actually just poured my 12, so I'm going to let that breathe. I'm going to go ahead and use my 14 year. Good things do come in little packages when it comes to these bottles. So pour the amount that you're comfortable with tasting. We're going to go through them all, so don't go too heavy if you don't want to. And the very first thing, this might seem a waste of whiskey, but I need y'all to do me a favor. Pour just a little bit in the palm of your hand, okay? I know it seems a waste, and I won't make a big mess. You don't need much, just a little whiskey right in the palm of your hand. And this is the fun part. What I want you to do is I want you to smack it and rub. Try not to splash it in your eyes like I just did. Give it a good rub, and then take a big smell. Okay, smack and rub again. Now that first big smell is kind of alcohol driven. You'll notice it's very strong on the sense. For a negative term, I don't like using it. It's a little peroxide-y, but you get the alcohol. Now take another big whiff. Very different, right? You get a little chocolate. Are you getting a little like a malt? Remember a frap or a chocolate malt? You're getting that malt flavor. Now let's do it one more time. And now the whiskey's almost gone. You thought your hands were going to be dirty. Now you're nicely sanitized. Take another whiff. Very different once again. What's that smell like? Anybody getting fresh loaf of bread?
Oh.
Or maybe a beer distillery if you've ever been to one?
I give that to you.
All right. So what we just did there is that's the first thing. If I was visiting your distillery and you were presenting a barrel of whiskey purchase from you, that would have been what I would have done to the whiskey, because the first sniff told me about the alcohol content. That was why that's the most gassish. It evaporates quicker than water. So the nice face full of alcohol let me know the alcohol content. The second lets me know about the grain. In this case, we're smelling malted barley. If you do that with bourbon, you're going to smell corn. It's very, very different smell. So that let me know about the grain production. And then the last one lets me know about the yeast. Every distillery is known for its own yeast production. And those are the three elements that really make whiskey whiskey. We'll get into what the wood and all that does. But that would have been a proofing test. So that's a kind of neat way to approach a whiskey. And as we go through, feel free to try that with the different whiskeys, and they'll have a little different character, particularly on the second smell. So now, as we're going to taste our whiskey, just smell it from a distance. And everything you do in tastings, from wine to beer to spirits, do everything 3 times. The first smell and the first taste are always going to taste like alcohol. As you smell a little bit more, you're going to start to get more of those sweet notes. And you can kind of work it up to your face. Now, the reason we're not putting our nose in there is if we plugged our nose and drank a scotch and a bourbon, they would taste exactly the same. The alcohol content of this scotch is so strong that the palate of what we're smelling is going through our nose, not our mouth. Your mouth would only identify alcohol. So all the nuances we get from whiskey are from our olfactory. So you just want to make sure you don't shock it in the beginning of a tasting. Now, this isn't the most attractive of methods, but the last thing I'm going to talk, and then we're going to start tasting, is those that are new to whiskey tasting or might have an aversion to whiskey. What I'd like you to do is put equal parts water and whiskey in your mouth. The whiskey connoisseurs, you can skip this step if you already like it. A little water does add a viscosity. Equal parts water to whiskey take away the burn and allow you to see some elements of whiskey that you probably haven't noticed in the past. Okay, being that it's got sweet notes and cherries and caramel and all these nice sandalwoods and vanilla. And if you're too hung up on the alcohol taste, that's very hard to identify. So feel free to use equal parts water, and then throughout the tasting, reduce the amount of water that you're going to add to your palate. Does that make sense to everybody? All right, so let's go ahead and taste now. We've smelled a few times. This 14 year. Again, first taste is going to be pretty alcohol driven, right? So take your second and do, if you're comfortable with it, those familiars, then try to aerate. So suck, kind of gargle the whiskey in your mouth a little bit. This isn't a great first date experience because it's not particularly attractive, but it is a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and give that a little swirl. Any volunteers? Somebody tell me what they're tasting there and smelling for that matter. Let's talk some notes there. You don't just need to hear me. Anybody? Don't be shy. Come on. Who's the chatty one? See, I should have made you all start with a shot of tequila. That would have got everybody talking. Okay. Well, as you warm up, chime in. But I will continue to talk because you're obviously all just riveted with everything I have to say. I want to hear what you have to say. So the flavor notes on this are very unique for a Scotch, being that the nose has some really nice baking spice. It's got cherries, and I get apricot for sure. I definitely get cigar box or cedar is something that I pick up off this. But then when you taste it, it has a very different dynamic. It's a little hot at first, but because it's a nice spicy finish. The rum cask really adds an element of flavor that's not normally found in Scotch. And now, as we're enjoying this, and go ahead and sip and enjoy. And again, for the whiskey connoisseurs, I suggest I just add a drop or two of water, just a little bit. I have my little eyedropper. I just like to see the different kind of, let the oils and the whiskey interact. It kind of changes the viscosity, and it also changes how aerated it is, meaning those gases that we're going to get. So I'm going to take a moment now, and let's start off. Let's talk about what Scotch is to begin with. We can all agree that whiskey is whiskey. And Chris nailed it. All bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. That's a great statement. It makes a lot of sense. So whiskey goes back to the Irish or Gaelic term wishka, which ultimately meant, or ashkaba, and they both meant water of life. When you get to Aqua de Vites and Aqua de Jos and other areas of the world used very similar terms. So from Greece to Scotland to Egypt, people tended to refer to spirits as the water of life in earlier, many, many centuries ago. So whiskey, it became that term. The development of different whiskeys, Scotch, American whiskey, bourbon, Japanese whiskey, Canadian whiskey, they all have different classifications. For a Scotch to be considered what it is, it has to A, be made only in Scotland and on Scottish ground. It has to have been made from product from Scotland in the sense of their raw grain. They can't import outside grains. That being said, now there's terminology of Scotch that becomes very apparent, okay? The first is, we all know the term single malt. So if anyone's feeling chatty, can anyone tell me what a single malt means? I'll tell you what it doesn't mean, and people often think it does. It does not mean that it came from one barrel. People often hear single malt and think that one barrel got filled with whiskey, sat for 12 years, and then we drank it and it was delicious. That's not how it works. Single malt means it came from one distillery, okay? One single location. All the different barrels have very different characters in the warehouse, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Most Scotches, the majority of Scotch is made with 100% malted barley. To hold single malt classification, it has to be a single grain. I'm not aware of any 100% wheat Scotches out there. In theory, they could do it, but it wouldn't taste like what we expect when it comes to Scotch. So, one location for single malt. The second confusing element is the age statement. So, when we see a 12-year Scotch, what that does not mean is that all the Scotch in that bottle is 12 years old. It means that the youngest Scotch in that bottle is 12 years old. Scotch, very different than bourbon, is actually created with something called assemblage. And assemblage comes from cognac. Assemblage is the blending of multiple sources to create the final product. And it's very different than a lot of other whiskey makers because Scotch really does... it adapts to its age statement, but there's a lot of character that goes to the different barrels. So simplifying, I'll paint a picture. So we have three versions here. The 17-year is very rare. We're going to drink that next. And then we have a 12 and a 14-year. The 12 is their flagship. So the 12, the section of the warehouse that has 12-year-old barrels is constantly being reset with barrels that are going to age for 12 years and then barrels that have aged for 12 years. Now, think of the section of the warehouse that's the barrels that have aged for 12 years. And then as the weeks and days and months roll forward, some of those barrels have now obviously been there a very long time. They're in the same section of the warehouse in Balvenie. Those are the barrels that they're going to make their 12-year base spirit in, and then they move forward. Now, going into rarities like 21 years, 18 years, 25 years, 30 years, you can imagine that that portion of the warehouse is a lot smaller. So that adjustment goes to the scale, if that makes sense. So basically, you're constantly making your flagships, and then you're cultivating your specialty items or your older scotches. All right. Now, as we're tasting, your palate's probably calming down. The whiskey is opening up. I really do. I highly, especially with this one, the couple drops of water there, even for those purists out there, add just a little H2O. It really does open this whiskey up nicely. This is also the point where, as we go through these, you want to drop an ice cube in there? That is your scotch. There's non-judgment. There's nothing wrong with putting a little ice in here. I mean, you can put ginger ale, but I don't recommend it with such good scotches. So let's talk a little bit more about the barrels, right? As we're enjoying this one, I would put out there that, so David Stewart is the longest sitting malt master in the Scottish market. So he's the head of Balvenie, and he has been there active since 1962. He is the longest standing distiller in a position where throughout Scotland, there's only, one per generation. So there's a lot of distillers that have been in the position for a long time, but this dude is the master of it. What he did was something very cool. William Grant started Balvenie, and William Grant now owns Glenfiddich. It owns Bowmore. It's severely invested into Japanese whiskeys. So William Grant has become a huge conglomerate whiskey family or spirits family. So it was a tradition of Balvenie. When David Stewart came in, he made some changes. He was one of the first guys to do some kind of aggressively unique things that no one had done before. The majority of scotch is finished in ex-bourbon barrels, which is a fancy way of saying a used bourbon barrel. People have always liked our oak, and our bourbon barrels are nice because they've already been matured and they've already been saturated. So it actually saves for the evaporation, which we'll come back to that a little bit later. But David was the first person to take his barrels. He would age, so the 12-year, for instance, spends the majority of its time in those ex-bourbon barrels. And then he just puts them for a few months in a sherry barrel. And that was the first time anyone had ever done that. And then he moved on to port barrels and rum barrels and other types of whiskey barrels. And it was a very unique thing that he was able to do to season his whiskeys in a way that had never been done before. And now across the board, everyone in Scotland tends to take on those styles, and they are kind of the gold standard for worldwide whiskey making. So you see that other whiskey making regions have taken on that same element of finishing their whiskeys off in a barrel that had another spirit in it. Any questions at this time? Any comments? Everybody enjoying? Scotch got your tongue. Okay, totally fine. So, okay, let's move on to the 17-year. Now, one thing with Scotch, I say the same thing with wine. It's good to basically have the more expensive stuff first, bottom line. I mean, the more unique or the rarer, the higher content, you want to enjoy them while your palate is fresh. People often have starter wines and a little, a reception wine for cocktail hour, and then they pull out the Opus One for dinner when the steaks are served. Well, sadly, if you already had a vodka soda, a rosé, a glass of Merlot, and now and then you just had a salad and all your palate has gone a million different ways. So it's sad that this flagship or premium wine gets served after you've burnt your palate. The same thing applies with whiskeys, where you really want to go in the depth of, like, some are darker and some are sweeter or heavier. It's nice to go with the one that you think is the most rare first, because that's the one you're going to taste the best. Now, we're not chugging these, so I started with the 14-year because it's the sweetest of the bunch, and I wanted you to see the 17-year and 12-year together. My point in all that is saying is, so we're going to start with the 17-year because I want you to see the nuances of difference between the 17 and the 12. So go ahead and pour a little bit of your 17-year whiskey. Now, as we're smelling this, take our time, 3 times, remember. And right below the nose, totally different smell than the first. Very much in that vanilla, right? Yeah, I'm getting a lot of like sweets in general, like cocoa. It's almost a little buttery. Very cool nose. I'm going to give mine a moment before I sip, but feel free to do yours whenever you're ready. So to lay down, so we talked about the different barrelings. The 12-year is their flagship. So that became very popular. The double wood, that was David Stewart's coined phrase, catchphrase, if you will, because he used 2 different barrels. So this is basically that we look at that section of the warehouse that had 12 years. Well, it did so well, they took some of those 12 years and just popped them over into a new section. And then now they wanted to hold those for an additional 5 years. So now they have the same barrels. Now they're spending again, the majority of their time is still in that ex-bourbon barrel, and their time in sherry is the same as the 12-year. So they're aging as they would and then simply seasoning with that sherry barrel. So let's go ahead and taste. So for those non-whiskey drinkers, I think that this one might be a little eye-opening to you. It's a little bit more delicate, and it's the barley on it. You can tell it's obviously it's more aged. So because of that, it's ended up more refined. It's very green. This is honestly my first time trying the 17-year, by the way. I'm very familiar with Belvini, but this was a new release, so I was super excited to get this package. It has a lot of green note that I wouldn't have expected so much of. Almost little peppers and like fresh cut grass. Very nice, very light. That's delicious. So let's talk a little bit more about, again, so the characteristics. I'm going to talk a bit about bourbon at the end, and Scotch has its own identity. And something that is important to understand is something called terroir. So terroir means the environment. Terroir is everything. It's the sun, it's the water, it's the wind, it's the people that are walking the fields, the equipment they're using, the animals that are there, what other kind of, what crops are growing in and around, apple trees, all those things affect the terroir. It's commonly used in the wine world. Scotch is very affected by its location. And the reason I say that is bourbon is done where the content of the corn, so their mash bill, the wood they use, and their yeast, which is those things we looked at in the beginning when we smelled our steamed whiskey, that affects bourbon by where they sourced those supplies dramatically. And then bourbon is done in what's called a column still. It's a sealed environment. Okay, so that sealed environment it's not introduced to oxygen or its atmosphere of the location of the distillery, not nearly as much. There's elements of it, especially in the barrel, but not in distillation. With Scotch, it's very different. Scotch, they're all getting their sources from the same places. So they're not picking a bunch of different types of barley. They're not picking a bunch of different types of wood, and they're not creating a bourbon distiller will choose a tree while it's still standing, and I want that tree, and that's what my cooperage is going to make my barrels out of. The Scotch, they've received barrels disassembled and reassembled in their cooperage, but the wood is already treated. My point being, Scotland, they're getting their barrel. They all have like, think of it as like Home Depot. So Scotch is good. Scotland is going to a place to source out all of their elements and then bring them back to their distilleries. And then they ultimately are creating their Scotch in their distillery. And they all have a lot of different characters. Versus the column still we talked about, Scotch is pot stilled. So pot still has a physical opening. It's generally three different pots where it's pumped and transferred, but they also open the tops and scrape the sides. There's a lot of different elements where oxygen and the terroir, or the environment of the distillery, is implemented during fermentation when you're dealing with pot stilling. It's a little bit more of a traditional method. So the air in Speyside is very different than the air in Islay. So that's where you get those nuances of the different flavors, is of course in the distiller's blending technique and what type of what wood specifically they did end up going with, but it's not reflective of, it wouldn't taste the same if they did the same 2 doses in 2 different locations, and bourbon would. So Scotch is affected by its area. And that's where it gets really cool, because most Scottish distilleries have been running for hundreds and hundreds of years. So they've had plenty of time to kind of analyze the effects that the different areas are going to have on their Scotch. A really unique thing, and as we're tasting, continue to taste throughout. I'm just talking. And again, this is now, I'm going to add my water, just a couple of drops. I just want to see what this tastes like without that burn. It's delicious. Again, it gets some real nice sweet. When you add the water to it, it gets a little more like a taffy element going on. There's definitely a lot of sweet elements to this. It's sweeter than I would expected, and just nice big ripe cherries. It's got really nice flavor. I love the 14-year though, and still the 14-year instantly makes me want to go to my humidor and smoke a cigar. So as much as I'm enjoying this, it still isn't knocking the 14-year out as being one of my favorites. So we get back to talking about the influences on Scotch. And how about peaty? Okay, those that know Scotch, you identify peat when you drink Scotch. Perhaps those that smell Scotch for the first time or are familiarizing themselves, ooh, it's super smoky, or if it's negative and they don't like it, it smells like, or a Band-Aid or iodine, and there's this, it's saline is what you're smelling. There's definitely a salt element to it, and people will often say, oh yeah, it's peaty, it's a peaty Scotch. Well, what if I were to tell you that only 5% of Scotch is actually peated? It next to people saying that bourbon has to come from Kentucky, because it does not. The second most common mistake, I think, in whiskey is thinking that Scotches are peaty. Islay is the only area that adds Scotch, and it actually ends up being, it's called parts per million. So they do parts per million of a peated element that's added during the fermentation process. The other areas don't add peat. Where peat became indicative of Scotch was actually that they would dry the barley over peat fires. Scotland's not a very large area, and it doesn't have very lush options of wood. So in general, Scotland is not going to burn wood. They had much better things to use their few and far between trees for, so they tended to burn peat. They also built houses out of it and a lot of things. So it's ultimately broken down swamp greenery. So it's an area that it's condensed. And like we would have used sod for the frontier here, they use peat. They cut out squares of earth, and that is a solid unit. So they would smoke the barley over peat. So people associated that smell as automatically being from the Scotch having peat added to it or used to dry. Unfortunately, that isn't the way it's done anymore. Now it's a more modern element. So there's gas, and they dry the barley in different areas, and ultimately a lot of the times the barley is actually sourced out by larger manufacturers. So the peat element is a misinterpretation of how rich or deep the notes of the flavor of the Scotch are, which has to do with their terroir, like we talked about, and then how they blended them together. So again, with that blending element, you have to think of these guys going through barrels like this, but a lot larger, 500 gallons, sometimes more. They remove this top element, right? They take this top out. It's kind of embarrassing, but it's actually called a bunghole. That's where the term bunghole comes from, is the top of a whiskey barrel. They take an apparatus like this. They actually wear these around their necks. So if you can see this is a copper tube with a cork top. Okay. So the guys work in the warehouse wear these around their necks. Not a bad job when they're part of their day is to taste whiskey, or if they stub a toe or have a bad day, they might go do this as well. So they take out the top and they slide this right into the barrel, and they pull out a taste, and then they make identifications of where that barrel is. This tells them when to turn the barrel. It's called riddling or racking rather. I'm sorry, racking is the turning of the barrels, and so they'll taste it, they'll identify where it is, and then they'll make markings on the side of the barrel, go on to the next one. Later on in life, once those barrels are getting close, then they have these small little units that the distiller will use, which is just a little copper funnel, little copper cup. Kind of cool set. This is actually from the Balvenie distillery. This was a very neat set a friend gave me. So they would go through, take a little bit of this barrel, a little bit of that. They'd combine them in this small cup right on the floor and say, okay, these are what I'm looking for. Let's take barrel number 52A and barrel 58C and bring them to the mixing room, and then that's where they would start to blend the different types, the different barrels to create what we all know as being Balvenie 12-year. And it's done to an extent with bourbon, but it's not done to that extent. The more similar than bourbon to Scotch is how they do it in cognac. Cognac mastered assemblage between the development of cognac and then a lot of the aging process and the bottling process. You actually have to give the credit to champagne. Champagne had a big part in how they handle these barrels, how they get them to bottle, and the differences in the environment. So now, we think, okay, so these barrels, we fill them in and they season in there, and that makes sense. Well, it gets a lot more complicated than that. These barrels have what's called an angel's share and a devil's cut. So the devil's cut is what the barrel absorbs. That is one reason Scotland likes using bourbon barrels, is because those barrels have already absorbed a significant amount of whiskey. So in theory, they're less porous. Bourbon barrels are also charred for that same reason. It seals them. So the devil's cut might be lessened by a used saturated barrel. The angel's share is what evaporates through the cracks in the barrel. Now, while they will drip slightly, and that's not the goal, they are in theory watertight. Alcohol evaporates at a much lower temperature than water. So that also means on a molecular level, it's a lot smaller. So basically alcohol can seep its way out of these barrels, as does some of the whatever water content is left in there, and that evaporates through. So understanding that if I put 500 gallons in a 500 gallon barrel, well, they're 50, they wouldn't be that big, a 50-gallon barrel. If I left a 50-gallon barrel full for 5 years, when I came back, there would only be 20 gallons left. So that's how much, more than half would have dissipated in that 5 years. So what they're doing is constantly topping them off. So they're filling them because a fuller barrel does better because it has less room for more evaporation and angel's share. They tend to keep warehouses hot. So again, there's a lot of action going on there. And then when they move them, that stirs them up a little, gets a little chemistry going on in there. So all those elements make more of that evaporation take place, which adds to the concentration of the liquid that's left in the barrel. But it's also, wasteful ultimately. So they have techniques of how they continuously fill these barrels and keep them where they are at a saturation point that allows them to age the way they want them to. Okay, so let's go on forward and pour the 12-year, which I had mistakenly poured first. So I have it here nice and aerated. So now, honestly, the unique thing with the 12-year and tasting the 17-year first, this 12-year is one of the most popular in the planet. But truth is, it's everything that you just tasted in the 17-year and then minus. So there's not going to be much in this one. that you didn't get out of the 17, it's just going to be a little different. So this is kind of like a drop set. So in other words, the 12-year has a few less characteristics. The funny thing about flagship scotches, Mac 12, Johnny Walker Black, Glenmorangie 10, Balvenie 12, is they're delicious. There's a reason they became so popular. This is a very nice, it's just a really well-balanced scotch. It's finally a joke. That's absolutely, yes, angels are very greedy, but they're quite happy. That was a good note. I like that 12-year. I find that it is a little bit more linear in its flavor, but just really well balanced. You know, when you get into the basic ones, it's like, you know, Coca-Cola has themselves down to a science. Pepsi has itself down to a science. Like this really just is just a really, really well balanced, very sippable scotch. Yeah, I love that. I'm going to add my water now. And now you've gone through the 3. So this is a great opportunity. Add your ice, do your thing. If you really don't enjoy it and you've earned a cocktail, then now you can go ahead, add the ginger ale, add the ginger beer. You know, Scotch is not commonly used in the blending of cocktails. I suggest it for Manhattans. I suggest it for, you can make old fashions with it, but generally Scotch is a sipper. I do love a whiskey and ginger. I don't drink soda pop these days. I haven't in many years. But every once in a while, I'll still sneak one because I had my like CC and ginger days where a big one in my 20s. So I do still appreciate that kind of reminiscent flavor. But Scotch generally, Manhattan, which would be called a Rob Roy, is pretty common. And then they do use them in some things like Blood and Sand, or EuroTier is a very nice, if you want to look that up. It means town square. It's a New Orleans drink with Scotch, and it's got a little bit of Benedictine and absinthe in there. So the EuroTier is a nice Scotch cocktail. You know, there's definitely a few out there, but it's not known for being blended often. And we talked about single malts. So now the blended scotches like Dewar's and Chivas and the majority of Johnny Walker, those blended scotch means that they can source it from multiple locations. So wine does that a lot. Cognac totally does it. And Bordeaux and Burgundy, that's all they do. It's called negociant. So negociant, they trade either raw product or finished product with other vineyards, and then they use it to fill their quota of what they need of different elements to make their blends. So a blending process with Scotch means that they've ultimately traded between different locations, and then they are able to fill the void of what they need. Some blended scotches started also adding just a little bit of wheat. Same thing happened across the board in the United States. When they added wheat was basically because there was a period of time, particularly around Prohibition, when everyone started getting a taste for Canadian whiskey. And Canadian whiskey, no offense, I'm from Minnesota, so I'm in like southern Canada, but Canada makes probably the lowest grade of whiskey. Well, they do have some good ones, so I'm sorry if I'm offending any Canadians. But in the world of whiskey, they've always been kind of linear. They're high rise, they're low age, they add coloring, which is very frowned upon, and they were just kind of quick production, but people loved them. Canadian Club, Seagram 7, those all had some really big placements, and they were primarily made out of the Canadian style whiskeys. So that was a differentiation. Kind of cool fun fact there as you're sipping. If you'll notice, Scotch and Canadian whiskeys are spelt with KY in the whiskey, and Irish and American whiskeys are spelt KEY. The reason for that was that during Prohibition, they started releasing gut rot or like fake whiskey. One of the things that helped end Prohibition was the major hit it took on our economy, and the fact that we started growing other countries' economies by purchasing so much of their spirits. During that time, Scotland, that is, you know, renowned for making some of the very best spirits in the world, was producing some pretty lowbrow stuff. It's where you see like the J&Bs and the Cutty Sarks, and that taste of that kind of blended, quick, really hot, not very tasty whiskeys. But we all know them because they were very big in the 50s because people acquired a taste for them. Those were considered cheating. So ultimately, the United States and Ireland agreed to make some trademark requirements in order to use our selling. Canada and Scotland decided that they didn't want to partake, so they kept their original spelling, and we introduced the E. It's one of those tricky things too, because like newspapers, I read a thing about like the New York Times will have a really hard time deciding which spelling it wants to use because either one is correct. So if they're just speaking of whiskey, they tend to add the E, but it confuses people from time to time. And then you get little small exceptions. So anyone that drinks Maker's Mark, if you look at your Maker's Mark bottle, that's spelled KY. Maker's Mark is also finished in those pot stills we talked about. So Maker's Mark is a Scottish family that went to bourbon country, became a big name, but they always prided themselves on doing it the Scottish way. So when the name change took place, Maker's Mark decided to politely not participate, and they did not add the E. So kind of cool fun fact there. Any questions? Are we all just enamored with our... I hope you're all enjoying. You are the quietest group ever. Yeah, perfect. Okay. Well, then we've tasted these amazing scotches. You still have a little bit on hand, so going forward, play with these a little bit, try them how you like. It's a great time. If you, like I said, if you have a cigar, I'm guilty. I will definitely be sitting down with a cigar and one, if not a couple of these this evening. I'm looking forward to enjoying them. But the world of Scotch is very unique, and it's earthy. It's got that saline. It's got a little smoke to it. So if you like that, then you know this is a Speyside, by the way. We didn't talk much about that. So Speyside is kind of the nucleus. It's closer to the ocean. Highlands tend to be like Glenmorangies and Macallans, and then Islays. Those are those really, really aggressive smoky ones. Lafroig, Lagavulin, Ardbeg, Bowmore, Bruichladdich. So those are the ones that will come off of Islay. If you want something really... no, you can definitely smell the 17-year with your hands. Only use a little tiny amount, and you'll absorb it through your skin. It's good. It's a great sanitizer. I just saw in the note somebody asked if the 17 is too good to sniff. Definitely sniff it. Enjoy it. That's a fun thing to do with whiskeys. Lost my train of thought, but yeah. So playing around with the different scotches, where basically the northern you go, they're going to have a little bit more air to them. They're lighter in color. They tend to be in gold or yellow bottles, which is cool. And then down south towards Islay, it's not a very big place, Scotland, but down that way, and Talisker is off to the west. Those ones all get more smoky. And they tend to use green bottles, which is a nice way to identify. It's not 100% rule, but it's a cool way to identify most. It's like a secret little Easter egg when you're looking at Scotch bottles. So try them out. Try different ones. With this last 15 minutes then, so what I normally do is Q&A, and I'm going to go ahead and say that, so if anyone has any questions, go ahead and shout them out now. But otherwise, I'm just going to talk a little bit about bourbon and then briefly about Japanese whiskey. What's the history of the gold and yellow bottle? I don't know. I would be guessing, but I'm going to go ahead and guess that it has something to do with the glass blowers from the area. So that's a total guess, but it leads me to another point. Another cool thing about Scotch in their packaging, so particularly very expensive Scotches always come in these really far out boxes. So that's a thing in cognac as well. They like lacquered boxes. They're handmade. Now we're talking very luxurious. When I opened the casino Encore in Boston, or Everett rather, we spent $2.5 million on about 25 bottles. Okay, so you're talking. Oh no, I'm sorry. It's more like 75 bottles. But our unicorn collection, as we called it, was 2.5 million. And these were bottles that ranged from $10,000, $15,000. We had a couple $30,000 bottles, just extraordinarily rare scotches, cognacs, bourbons, a thing called Last Drop. We had some really far out for, the real high-end clientele at a casino. It's definitely a place you can spend plenty of money. $4,000 or $5,000 for a portion for some 50-year Macallans and whatnot, Mac M. Well, all these things come in these really elaborate, ornate boxes. And the reasoning behind that is that, A, the distillers have access to all these great cooperages, and they have wood makers on hand that are already into making the barrels, and they're already professionals. So they make these boxes, and they have their apprentice that they're teaching how to make the boxes as an expression of the rarity of the line of Scotch. So the bottling is definitely relevant, but their packaging in general is a display of elegance or of craftsmanship. So some of those really, and like I used to tease, my daughter would play with this full open Macallan M box. It's a $13,000 bottle of Scotch, and I had nothing to do. And the box was all these mirrors. So I take home this little black lacquered box. It was about yay tall, about yay wide, and open it up, and it turned into a little dressing room for her dolls. They could go in there, Barbie could go shopping and stand in front of her mirrors. And I always thought it was really funny that I'd be walking by, and I'm a bartender, but at the end of the day, and my daughter's playing with what's probably a $1,500 box. So I thought that was cool. All right, so really quick, just touching on bourbon, or touch on the other whiskey. So now we talked about the requirements of Scotch. Bourbon is a right now. Oh.
There was another question from Christian Bregendahl asking that Costco's got several scotches under the brand name Kirkland, and do you have any comments on those?
Kirkland, I have only seen them. The beauty, there's 1,200 plus distilleries in Scotland, and I cannot take claim to have tasted them all. I've seen them, I've heard of them, but I can't speak of them. And this is funny because this is where I get stumped, and now I'm going to have to go tonight and research it. After 20 years behind the bar, somebody asks me a question I don't know, and I have to go find out. So I'm sorry, Chris, I don't have a direct response on that one. I will say Costco has their own line brands, and I believe that Grey Goose makes their vodka. I think Patron is making their tequila. So in general, they have a very good program. So I think that if Costco has invested heavily in them, that I would trust them as being smart procurement folks. So you could probably get behind their products. I don't know everyone's region, but if you have Total Wine in your area, Total Wine has changed the face of liquor shopping. There are items, to this day, it blows my mind when I walk through Total Wine and I see items that would have had to have been purchased at auction just 5 to 10 years ago. Not only are they a big box store, and I know it's hard, it's going to hurt the local liquor stores, and Home Depot put the hardware store out of business, so I can appreciate both sides of it, but they do what they do really, really well. And it's not just turn and burn stuff. They have the most incredible unicorn selection. So if you have Total Wine in your area, that's a good one to look for. While we're on that, is another thing people overlook. One of the very best places to source out any specific or specialty alcohol is at the airport. The duty free tends to run under certain guidelines for how much they can mark things up. They don't tend to price differently for allocations, and you can often save on massive amounts of sin tax. So if you are a collector and you're traveling, sometimes it's a good idea to look at the old whiskey selection at the airport. But yeah, so with bourbon, bourbon's a very different animal. Bourbon is an American spirit. It has a lot to do with our history. It's one of my favorite classes to get into, whiskey in general, but bourbon just is so rich with the founding of this country. Its classifications require to be on American soil, so you can't make it in Canada, but you can certainly make it in Hawaii. So bourbon has to be on American soil, and it has to be made with American corn, and it has to spend a portion of time in a charred new oak barrel. So an American charred oak barrel that is new. Those are the classifications. Corn, American soil, charred oak. Kentucky is not a requirement. Kentucky bourbon has to come from Kentucky. 90% of bourbon comes from Kentucky. Of the 10% that comes from elsewhere, 90% of that 10% has roots back to Kentucky or Tennessee, being that they are families that just branched out. But other that being said, there's great whiskeys all over, and Kentucky obviously has it mastered. But you've got the West Coast. You have Stranahan's out of Colorado. Templeton in Iowa generally makes ryes, but they've released a bourbon or two over the years. Right, my neck of the woods, Nantucket makes a great one called Nor'easter. It's from a company called Cisco. They make tons of money on beer and vodka. I know the owner, Matt Lambo, is a good friend of mine. He told me they lose money for every single bottle of whiskey that they make, but they make up for it in other categories. He only makes it because he wants to participate in competitions. So I thought that was something neat. So if you ever see Nor'easter, pick one up. It should be valued at a lot more. Bully Boy comes out of Boston. So there's a lot of cool ones. Texas has some really unique distilleries too. A lot of them don't pick up the bourbon name, but Texas has some very cool American whiskeys, including TX, which is just a Texas whiskey, and it's one of my all-time favorites. Things like Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels, I'll come back to that story. That's a good question. So, yeah. So Jack Daniels chose not to partake in the Bourbon Association because they didn't want to not coal filter. They could have adjusted and they could have made negotiations, but they simply said, you know what, we'll just call ourselves Tennessee Whiskey. They were kind of feeling Kentucky going its own way with the Bourbon Association. So Jack Daniels is generally the house bourbon in almost every bar you'll ever go into. In the movie The Shining, Jack Nicholson orders a house bourbon and Lloyd, the bartender, serves him a Jack Daniels, which I later on heard is because it's his character Jack and his son Danny are a reference. But point being, people have always thought of Jack as bourbon, and it's really not. Question for storing Scotch. That's a good question. It's extraordinarily longevic. You are okay. Anything above the ABV of 70% that isn't a specialty colored thing like chartreuse, Scotch will last on your shelf for an extremely long time. You don't want to put it in direct sunlight. You don't want to let it get too hot, and you don't want to let it get too cold. But that being said, the shelf life of a bottle of Scotch is literally in the like 50 to 60 years range. And if you can hold it that long, then you have more self-control than I do. I am a big fan of the old school crystal bottle with the big glass top. I have several of those in my little whiskey bar upstairs. I do like keeping them in a decant just because I find that the cork and whatnot on the bottle, sometimes opening and closing, can start to break down. I like being able to look at the coloring of the whiskey, so I do decant and put in liquor crystal bottles my more high-end selections that I want to enjoy and show off a little bit. So I think that's a good way to store them. But overall, your bourbons, your scotches, your cognacs will do just fine on a back bar. Lower ABV things you do need to watch out for: cordials, Cointreaus, triple secs, Grand Marniers. Things that people really make a mistake on is vermouths. Vermouths need to be kept in your fridge. Anything based on wine or grapes, rather. So Lillet Blanc, Liqueur Strega, Amaros, Cynar. You've got Rhubarbero, all your sweet vermouth, your dry vermouth. Those should all be kept. Your ports, your Madeiras, your sherries. Anything that's grape-based should be kept cold. But you'll also see that those are in that lower ABV. That's what tells you there. And then some of like the bitters category, like Fernet Branca, and again, Amaro. Chartreuse is green because of chlorophyll. So if chartreuse sits out too long, it actually will turn clear. You can still drink it, but believe it or not, chartreuse is green because of the same thing that makes a tree green. So that can fall out in the sunlight. But that's, yeah, unlike wine and unlike beer, spirits have a very long shelf life. It's a good question. Any other questions on there? Oh, well, so bourbon, bourbon is just tons of fun. Again, just taking, because we only have like 5 minutes, it's not worth me branching into another region. But I love pointing out that a cool thing about bourbon is how it developed. So we talked about the locations of Scotland and people came up in specific distilleries and it's been there for generations. That's a really cool element. A neat thing about about bourbon is it was a little bit more mobile. These were pioneers. These were pilgrims. These were immigrants. These were folks that came over, were working extraordinarily hard. They tended to be moving from east to west, particularly in the earlier days. And so they had to be able to pick up their tent or their lift camp and continue to move Yeah, actually, it will. They'd move west. And that's a cool story. But someone did just ask about Japanese whiskey, and I'm going to take that left turn and go that way. Japanese whiskey is awesome. And I would like to say Asian whiskeys because Taiwan has Kavalan and you're starting to see more come out. Japanese whiskey is so young and it accomplished so much in a short period of time. I highly recommend it. I have on my back bar right now is a Suntory Toki. Not crazy expensive. I wanted to get a Yamazaki last night. And I just couldn't drop the $180. It's been a long year. So Japanese whiskey goes back to two guys, and I'm just going to give you the short synopsis. A guy called Nika and a guy called Tori-san. So these two guys had tried a bourbon. They imported a bourbon, and they went gaga over it. We're talking like 1890, okay? 1890, these guys try a bourbon. Tori-san worked for a well-known sake-making family, and he's like, okay, cool. Nika, let's make some bourbon. This will be cool. They try a batch of bourbon. It's awful. They ruin it. This does not come out right. Tori-san decides to go over to Scotland to learn how to make whiskey. Now, he was looking at bourbon originally, but he spent his time in Scotland. He went and worked for Macallan. Stayed there for 12 years. Learned exactly the ins and outs, the nuances. It's because it takes 12 years to make a single batch of whiskey. They choose all the grain product, they choose the wood, they choose all that, and then as the process starts to age, 12 years later, you get to taste what you made. Comes back to Japan. Right out of the gate, there's a little adversity. So he and Nika, okay, I've got the technique. Let's make some whiskey. Tori-san lived it with his family in Yamazaki, and he said, okay, let's set up the distillery. Nika said, no, we're going to go where my family lives up in the north. I want to set up there. They got in a disagreement. They split right out of the gate. So Nika is in the northern part of Japan, and Yamazaki is located in more central west. They split up. They were kind of adversaries from that day forward. So now you have Nika up top, and Tori-san actually called they inverted his name, and that's where Suntory is just Tori-san spelled backwards. So Suntory opened up in Yamazaki. Now, he's got the technique. He did tell Nika how to make the whiskey, and they go through this whole process. They have this extraordinarily rare Japanese oak. It takes 200 years to mature. It's called Matsuka, and Matsuka oak takes 200 years, and it's very, very valuable. It had been made for like royalty furniture and castle furniture, and extremely expensive. So these guys make some barrels. They make the first run, and it doesn't turn out right. So the first run goes through. They're not happy with it. They make some more whiskey and bourbon barrels. It turns out okay. They're very upset because they wasted all this invested time, but they didn't give up. 5 years, it was awful. It tasted like pickles. It was very high acid. It just didn't work right. The oak wasn't right. They switched up their barrels. They sat on it. After a decade, it was amazing. They realized that oak just took longer to get the true devil's cut, so they had to sit on it longer, which makes Japanese whiskey that much more of a premium product because it's that much more of an investment in time and whatnot. So then the moment they figured out that sweet spot, now you're talking about 1950, 1960, they had the method. In 2003, they won the best whiskey in the world. And since 2003, they've won it 5 times. All bourbon has been made for a few hundred years. Scotch has been made for 700 years. Japanese whiskey has less than 100 years in the game, and they are by far one of the best. I highly recommend Japanese whiskeys. You'll notice at the liquor store they're expensive, but at restaurants they tend to be very affordable. The first thing I do if I'm sitting at a bar is look at what the bar has for Japanese whiskey, and they tend to be underpriced. I highly, highly recommend them. They're done in the style of Scotch, but they're light, they're elegant, and they have some very cool nuances to it. So, Chris, I think that gets me to about time. I'm happy to answer any more questions or anything else. I want to keep you all on schedule.